You're both Canadian?
Yes.
Yeah, bro.
Dude, I'm going to have to carry this show by myself.
This is Maxima. I personally think Maxima is like the strongest line out there. For me, I go through and I make a checklist of everything that I absolutely need, and then I make a checklist of things that I want.
I will spend any amount of money for good boots that are going to keep my feet comfortable and dry.
If I can't get them like really, really sharp, I just throw them away.
All right, guys, welcome to the Gritty Angler Podcast. Coming at you live from Utah. What city are we in? Orem? Orem. We're at Casa de Olthuis, and Derek was kind enough to have me over. I didn't want to make him lug all his gear over to my house because today's podcast is a gear review. Derek, you just got back from Iceland again.
Yep.
I'm not jealous at all.
You shouldn't be. It's terrible.
I know.
It's the worst place.
Looks like a bad place to fish, but you managed.
Managed. A couple good fish.
Oh, good. Yeah, you guys were slaying some big browns, although the weather was kind of crappy, I understand.
Yeah, it was pretty dang windy. The day that Court and I got there, the first full day of fishing, there was a wind advisory for gusts of 100 miles an hour. And I think that lasted for a few days. They had roads shut down because it was so windy. So it was pretty crazy.
That is crazy. Derek just showed me GoPro footage of Courtney trying to fish in the 100-mile-an-hour gale force winds. And I mean, the size of these white caps coming up, it looked like the ocean. Yeah, anyhow, kudos to you. You guys were really gritty in sticking that out, fishing those conditions. But what I've wanted to do for a long time, this is a gear review, is I want to know what is in your pack. So you just went to Iceland. You've got some other trips coming up this year, which are epic. You're heading to the Arctic. You're heading to Canada and a few other cool places. So I want to know, what do you carry with you? What do you consider essentials? What is always in your pack? And so when we get into this, I'm going to jump up and get behind the one camera and zoom in. And Derek's just going to start pulling stuff out of his pack for those of you that might be watching the video version of this podcast. And then just explain to our listeners what it is, why you like it, kind of what are the benefits of each of these gear items, if you will. Sound good?
Yeah. Oh, perfect.
So let's start with your rod and that cool pack, and I'm going to jump up behind the camera and let's roll.
So this is H2, Orvis H2 7-weight, and this is one of the rods that I took to Iceland. I also took an H2 8-weight and an Orvis Recon 7-weight. Whenever I'm going somewhere, like a bigger trip, then I always make sure that I take a few different rods in case we maybe switch up from streamers to nymphs, or in case I break a rod. That way I have a backup. If I'm just going out for the day, maybe I'll take one backup rod and I'll leave it in my car, or sometimes I'll rig it up and have it in a case like this, not rigged up, and thrown in the side of my backpack, just as a safety measure, I guess, or, in case maybe something changes throughout the day and whatever I started out throwing isn't working, and I can maybe have a rod that's a little better, a little more specific to whatever I change up to.
So always have a backup rod.
Always have a backup rod, yeah. I don't always carry one on me per se on the river, but I at least have one in my car just in case. If you drive out a few hours to go fish somewhere and you break your rod an hour into it, at least you have something in your car. If you don't, then you're in trouble. And then backpacks. This is a Watermaster dry bag pack. I've also got an Orvis bag as well that's waterproof. And for me, carrying camera gear, it's super, super important to have a waterproof bag, so I don't have to worry about all my expensive camera gear It gets rainy out there, or you fall in the river or whatever, and if you don't have a waterproof bag, then you could toast all your camera gear. So super important for me to have a waterproof bag like this. So I oftentimes will carry an extra reel on me, just maybe with a different line set up or something. This one's got an intermediate line on it, so that way if I'm fishing maybe like streamers for the day and I want to switch it up a little bit, maybe get a little extra depth on the streamer, then I have something that I can do that with. Or I'll sometimes carry a sink tip with me or whatever it might be. That way I can adjust to conditions, and just in case, I've never had an issue with any reels, but if I did, then I'd be ready on that front as well. But mostly just kind of a situational thing, as you go out for the day and conditions are always changing. In the morning, the fish might be hanging a little bit shallower, hunting. In the afternoon, as it gets hot and sunny, in the summertime, maybe those fish are going to hang out a little deeper if you're fishing a lake or something. And so if you have a different line, then you have a better chance at getting into them. Of course, I always carry a bunch of different flies. I have boxes of streamers, dries, nymphs, all that different gear just to make sure that my bases are covered. Obviously there's certain times of the year that things are going to be relatively predictable. Like if you're going out to fish a blue wing olive hatch this time of year, or, you're going to fish a lake that maybe has a chironomid hatch or whatever. But just in case, I always carry, a pretty big selection of flies. That way, if conditions change or they're not what I thought they would be, then I've got something to make it happen.
Let's open those up. Just take a quick look. So that's a streamer box.
Yeah, this one just has some big streamers thrown in there.
Nice. Derek likes to throw meat.
Just a little bit. The old drop jaw head on that.
Nice. The other one's smaller stuff.
This one's smaller stuff. I'll have a couple different flies or boxes with like nymphs in it or whatever. This one's obviously some bigger dries for this time of year, with any of the stones coming off, or the cicadas are starting to hatch, or maybe some salmon flies, whatever. So this time of year, it's good to have some bigger bugs like that, for sure. Seeing as we live in the Rockies, I always make sure I've got plenty of different layers and warm weather gear. I mean, weather obviously can change pretty quick here, and when we were in Iceland, we'd get some pretty sunny weather and it would be pretty warm, and so maybe I'd shed a layer, and a couple hours later it would be really windy and rainy, and so I'd need to layer up. So I always carry, especially if I'm a little bit more remote, like a hiking trip or something like that, I always carry a beanie to stay warm. And I always carry some different layers. So I've got a rain jacket in here, and I've got just an extra layer as well. And that way, if it starts raining or temperatures drop or whatever, then I can just layer up and I can stay out on the water, no problem. And I think a rain jacket is super, super important. And you and I, Chad, were just kind of talking about this earlier before the podcast started, of how we wear our rain jackets and stuff. I always put all of my layers inside my waders to start out with to stay dry, and then I put my rain jacket on the outside, so if it starts raining, no water slides down into my waders. And I keep the other layering jackets and sweaters and stuff on the inside of my waders, so that if I'm wading in waist deep water, that my jacket doesn't absorb water and get soaking. Of course, I carry camera gear, so I've got a bag that always has camera gear in it. I shoot with a Canon 6D, And I usually bring at least one extra lens, and then I bring some extra batteries in here, things like that. And then I always bring some extra SD cards, and I just have a separate little carrier for SD cards. And then within my camera bag, I will often pack an extra pair of sunglasses in there as well. So that way, if it's cloudy and I've got a lighter lens on, then I can switch out for a darker lens if it gets really sunny. So I always throw that extra pair of glasses in my camera case in its own case, just because I don't want my glasses to break, and they're expensive, so I put them in as much padded gear as possible. A couple extra random little things that I always bring. I always bring a ton of different spools of tippet. This is Maxima. I personally think Maxima is like the strongest line out there. And this is what I use for most of my streamer fishing, is like 8, 10, 12, and 15 pound Maxima. And so I pretty much always have a few extra spools of Maxima in my bag just in case. And then obviously got some smaller stuff for nymphing or dries. I carry a lot of Orvis leaders and tippets just so I can switch out and be prepared for whatever situation calls for. And one of the last things that I always carry in my bag that for me is like a must is a extra pair of keys. So kind of random story behind that, but I was actually out on the river with some clients one day doing a guide trip, and one of the clients wanted to take a nap in my car. So we headed out on the river and left one of the clients in the car, and he came out and he locked my car and he left the keys in there, and I didn't have an extra set of keys, and so we actually had to break out my window. We were in the middle of nowhere, break out my window to get in, and it was like $350. And luckily, the client was awesome, good guy, and he paid for the window to be repaired. But ever since then, I've just always kept an extra pair of keys in my bag.
Yeah, you guys, Western Waters Media, you had a similar experience in Canada once, didn't you?
We did, yeah. So that was actually, I guess, before my client broke out my window or left the keys in. We had to break out my window. But Court thought that I hadn't given him the keys when in fact I had, and we made a bet, and the bet was that I got to shave Courtney's beard, which he'd been growing for like 2 years, if he in fact had my keys. So we searched high and low, we couldn't find them, and Court swore up and down that he didn't have the keys, and he checked a few of his coat pockets and things, and the next morning we actually found them in Court's waders. So, but if I would have just had my extra set of keys, it wouldn't have even been an issue. So important.
Nice. All right, so we just kind of went through, this is everything that you carry in your dry bag there when you're out on the water. That's must have, don't leave home without.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
When you went to Iceland, how many items of checked luggage did you take?
I only had one big bag of check luggage, and then I had this backpack filled with all of my like laptop and reels and expensive stuff like that. And then I had another bag, my Pelican camera bag, just with all of my camera and batteries and all that stuff. So,
and that was your carry-on?
Those were my carry-ons, yeah, those 2 bags.
Yeah. So I just got back from Alaska. Went up there with Gritty Bowman on a bear hunt / it was kind of a cast and blast event. The primary reason we went was to hunt bears, but we also took our boots and waders and rods, and we'd planned to do a lot of fishing. as it turned out, the fishing wasn't on yet. It actually kind of sucked. But we gave it a go. But that was my real, first time flying somewhere that far away where I had to take so much gear. So I too, checked on my Pelican case, and then I had 2 big bags that I checked on as luggage. One big duffel bag with all my rods, tripods, all of that, and my hunting clothes, and then my backpack, which had my boots and waders, and a little bit of clothing in it. In addition to that, I shipped up a cooler full of gear because I had planned to bring back, bear meat and hopefully some fish, some halibut and salmon in it. So that was a lot of gear. And
you guys had a ton of gear.
And then we ended up coming back with 1 extra box, with my bear hide and skull and a little bit of meat in it too. So you've done this a lot more than me. What do you do to minimize, because that was expensive. When you count for whatever airline you take, that 3rd and 4th bag, those are $75 each,
each
to check
way.
those. And then shipping up that cooler, that was $120 each way. So
That's crazy.
It's a lot. Now, one tip I did learn was, rather than paying to ship stuff up, shipping is more convenient, but the airlines, like the airline I flew on was Alaska Airlines, each additional bag after the second one is $75. So coming back, that cooler, I actually checked it as luggage for $75
instead of
$120 to ship it.
Smart.
And Watermaster sent us a couple rafts up, and we did end up shipping those back just because we couldn't handle 5-6 pieces of big luggage, going through the airport.
Yeah.
But, if you've got anywhere from 2 to 4, I would say check it all as luggage rather than shipping stuff up.
Yeah, totally. I think that makes sense. I think for me, I go through and I make a checklist of everything that I absolutely need. And then I make a checklist of things that I want on the trip. And then I try and cut out as much stuff as possible. And obviously, the more you travel, the more you're able to kind of fine tune that list a little bit. I mean, there's things now that I don't take that I used to take on a trip, almost every trip. And I've just kind of cut those out because I never ever ended up using them, or they were never worth the hassle. And so I've, kind of streamlined the process a little bit. But
is that more clothing items, or is it gear and I don't know, knickknacks?
It's mostly clothing and random little items, but it's also gear. Like I used to take an obscene amount of rods. I would take like 5 rods on a trip, where now I usually take 3. Usually we'll take 1 backup of the primary rod that I'm going to use. So for instance, in Iceland, we were using 7 and 8 weights. Mm-hmm. So I brought, a rod that would serve as a backup, and then I usually bring a rod in case there's a little bit different condition. So, like a 6 weight or something would be a good rod to have for nymphing, or even like the off chance that there's a big midge hatch and there's big fish in Iceland that come in and eat dries.
Yeah.
So I tend to try and take 3, maybe 4 rods at max, where before I took 5, 6 rods kind of thing. So.
Oh, wow.
And then you had to bring reels for every one of those, and, it just ended up being so much gear that it was ridiculous. And same thing with fly selection. I've kind of weeded down my fly selection a little bit, where I used to take 15 boxes of flies, and you don't even end up using more than like 10 different flies in general. And so I try and do a better job of kind of researching out what I'm actually going to need and what's kind of, the general things. And then I take a few of my favorite patterns from here and just kind of try and take maybe like 2 or 3 boxes of flies instead of like just 10 plus boxes.
One thing I usually try to do, and we did a terrible job of on this Alaska trip, we brought way too much gear. Brian showed up with enough gear to outfit all of us. It was crazy. But, to your point, cutting back on the number of rods, number of reels or whatever, if you're going with 2, 3, 4 guys, if you all bring one backup rod, chances are that's enough to cover everybody.
Oh, yeah.
If somebody breaks a rod, or say 2 or 3 guys break a rod, there's still backups there, right?
Yeah.
So you can cut back there. You can each bring, one of you bring an 8, one of you bring a 6 weight as your backups. And if you don't mind lending out rods to your buddies, right?
Yeah, totally.
And the same thing with reels and all the gear that you're bringing. I don't think anybody, some guys might bring backup waders, but, Brian actually ended up tearing a big hole in his waders. And so his were kind of useless past his knees. It's always his butt that he has trouble with in waders, tight waders around his legs and butt. I don't know how he ripped them, but he did. Get with your buddies and, camera gear too. We brought maybe a little too much camera gear between all of us, and that's heavy equipment.
Yeah.
But when you're planning to film it, you want to make sure you got what you need for sure.
Yeah, totally. And that's the tough thing for us, especially like we all shoot on different platforms. Like I shoot on Canon and Panasonic. Court shoots on Sony. Phil shoots on Sony and Canon. So, I mean, there's some crossover, but, it's tough because we all want to bring our cameras and we all need batteries. I mean, especially with the remote trips that we go on, there's oftentimes not somewhere that you can just plug in and recharge your batteries. So we have to have batteries enough to last us for the entire trip, which all those things just add up. But, I kind of streamline my camera gear a little bit too and just say, okay, I'm on this trip, I'll probably be shooting more like long distance shots because I want to get some wildlife in there. And so I need this lens, which means I need to leave this other lens behind kind of thing or whatever. And I try and just take a few of my favorite lenses and try and cut weight and baggage that way too.
Right. Yeah, you brought up a good point I wanted to cover. So Brian and I both record on Sony now. So that's the cameras we use. They take the same batteries. 2 of our cameras can fit the same lenses. And so that's helpful going forward where we can cut down on the number of batteries and lenses that we need to bring.
Yeah.
I try to do the same thing with all of my flashlights, headlamps, GPS, anything electronic. Now I try to buy as much as possible items that take the same battery type. So I'm not having to bring AAAs, AA's, a D cell, and a C123 or whatever, batteries these things take as much as possible. Then I only need to bring, 2, 3 extra batteries. And if one thing goes out, I can take it out of my GPS and put it in my headlamp if I'm walking out at night or whatever.
Yeah.
Now,
that's smart.
It's just a little bit of weight, but if you're backpacking, that helps.
Adds up.
One thing that was confirmed to me from this 2-week trip to Alaska with Brian, I much prefer to drive to my destination opposed to flying. Flying bites.
It's a lot easier to take all the gear that you might want when you're just driving, as opposed to if you're flying somewhere, you definitely have to cut gear out,
Yeah, so I'm just waiting for that bridge to Iceland, and then I'll go with you.
Yeah, well, I don't think it'll be done by next year, but...
No, but I'm looking forward to that next year. I'm there for sure.
It's going to be sweet.
Well, any other gear, packing, travel tips, Derek, that we didn't get to?
This is just in general, but I think it applies even more so for a trip, is I think using quality hooks is a huge thing. So the reason why I bring that up is I just got back from Iceland. You just got back from Alaska. So you're paying all this money to go on a big trip. And for us in Iceland, they're big, huge brown trout, and they pull hard. So if you have
hence the 7 and 8 weight rods that you took.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're going all that way and spending all that money, and you're trying to target big fish, and guys just bring their flies that they got at the fly shop, that maybe have a good hook but not a great hook on it, or they're not like a super stout hook or something like that, and you hook into that fish of a lifetime and it bends you out, then that's like a huge bummer. So before I go on any of my trips, like be that Iceland or, like last year I went and fished for tarpon, I went through and I made a pile of all my hooks that were good hooks, and I checked them for rust or any damage, and I checked the points on them to make sure that they were sharp. And if I had hooks that maybe I'd snagged up on a rock or something, then I either try and sharpen them the best I can, and if I can't get them like really sharp, I just throw them away. Because for me, I just spent, let's say, $3,500 or $4,000 to go on this trip.
Right.
And if I don't go to the store and I don't spend the extra $50 to buy those quality hooks and tie some flies that I need on good hooks, then I might have just thrown away the whole purpose of my trip. I hook into that fish of a lifetime and the hook's dull. Yep. Or it was rusty and it breaks out. Or, like last year when we were in Iceland, I tied on a streamer and the hooks were a little wimpy. I didn't even check it. And I ended up hooking a big fish and it bent my hooks out.
Really?
And I think it was probably the biggest fish of the trip that I hooked. And, it was just a simple oversight. Grabbed a streamer out of my box, didn't follow my own advice, and paid the price.
That bites.
Yeah, it sucked.
Especially when you can, point it back to a simple error that you knew better and it was an easy fix, right?
Yep, it was a tough pill to swallow, and I still, this year I hadn't forgot it, and so before we left, I went through all my boxes of streamers and all the flies that I knew I was probably going to use, and I threw some of them away, and I sharpened other hooks, and then I went and I tied new flies on all super good hooks. I went and bought a ton of Gamakatsu hooks.
Yeah,
those are just retied because I just didn't want to deal with that again. So, for me, especially where you've spent the money to go on this trip, just spend a little extra money and get a good quality hook, because it's a bad feeling to lose a fish over that.
Well, and in addition to hooks, you and I had this conversation recently too, just gear in general. The conditions I was hunting and fishing in Alaska were not ideal by any means. 3/4 of the day it was just rain. rain. Everything was wet. And for you in Iceland, it was rain and wind. And having good gear can make or break a trip like that. And again, if you're spending $3,000 to $4,000 on this trip of a lifetime, who knows? For me, I'm planning to go to Iceland with you next year. Who knows if I'll ever get back to Iceland? And if I show up with crappy gear and I'm unprepared, it might ruin that trip of a lifetime.
Totally.
So for me, you got to have good rain gear, which you already mentioned. If you're wet, it sucks. And if you're wet, you're going to get cold. That's going to cut your day short. You're going to want to go back early. You're going to want to call it quits early. That clip you just showed me of Courtney fishing in the wind and the rain and those waves. He couldn't have done that without good gear.
No, for sure. I mean, I always say there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, like Court and I, we fished all day and we stayed pretty much dry in the wind and the waves and the rain. And, we just had the right gear and we were prepared. So it worked out.
Yeah. And for me, number one starts with my feet. Good boots, whether I'm hunting or fishing. And if my feet get wet, if they get fatigued, if I get blisters, it just ruins the whole day. So I will spend any amount of money for good boots that are going to keep my feet comfortable and dry. And it's got to start there. And then you can do the layering system with socks. If you're doing a lot of walking, I've talked about this on another podcast, but get sock liners and put them inside your good merino wool or whatever type of synthetic sock you're going to use. Don't ever buy anything cotton. Don't ever use cotton.
Yeah.
But get merino wool or synthetics, and those sock liners help your feet slide, if there is any movement, within your good insulating sock, and it reduces hot spots, and you don't get blisters. And then you talked about layering. You always got to have a mid layer and a base layer, and then your outer layer, which is your rain gear or whatever type of jacket that can keep you dry, and maybe has some wind stopper in it. Wind stopper's huge.
Oh man, that was the biggest thing in Iceland was the weather. I mean, it was cold. It was in the high 40s, low 50s, but that wind, when it was howling, it just cut through your gear. And so we had to, luckily I had a jacket with wind stopper in it, and then my rain jacket cuts the wind pretty good, and that kept me warm. But man, when we were just jump out of the car and layering up and getting geared up for the day, you could just feel that wind cutting to the bone. I mean, it was so cold.
Yeah. And if you don't have good layers on that breathe and allow that moisture to escape, and you're a little sweaty, and then that wind comes in and chills you. I tell you what, my first 2 days in Alaska, I got chilled. And because it's humid up there. And when the wind came, it just chilled me to the bone. And if I didn't have an extra layer to throw on, which one day I didn't, I had to borrow one from Brian. But, that's just something I wasn't prepared for, is the humidity in that wet cold. So again, if you and your buddies all have extra this and one of extra that, you can borrow from your buddies if you're already wearing your extra layer.
Yep.
So good gear is a must. And what I have found in general in the outdoor world with gear is the better quality gear is often lighter.
Yeah.
It's less weight that you have to carry and less pack around. Just because it's made better, it's made with better materials, which is often lighter in weight.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's true even with simple stuff like rods and reels and whatever. That the better gear is often lighter weight.
Yeah. Now, I know most guys would love an H2 like this rod here, but just buy the best that your budget allows you to buy. This is a $900 rod, but there's a lot of great $400 and $500 rods out there too that are pretty much just as lightweight as the H2.
Yeah, they're close for sure.
And the same with rain gear and all of that. Just buy the best that your budget can afford. I can't tell you how many times I've bought something just to have it, but if I'd waited and I didn't end up using it because it wasn't really what I wanted and it didn't really do the job, if I'd just stayed patient and saved up another month or two and bought what I really wanted, it would have been way better.
Yeah.
So don't compromise.
Well, and I think I get asked this a lot too, is, oh, what camera do you shoot on? And I always tell people, but then I ask them what they're using it for, and oftentimes they're using it for something slightly different than I am. Like they're doing maybe exclusive video and almost no pictures or, whatever. So my camera setup isn't going to be necessarily the camera setup that they want to use, which is relative to gear because, like what works for me isn't going to necessarily work for you. So do a little research, just kind of figure out what exactly you're going to be using it for, and then go from there.
Yeah. That's a good point. And on the camera gear, by the time you're listening to this, I'll have just released a camera gear podcast, a part 1 and a part 2 that we recorded with you and Brian. And we talk about that on the podcast. Brian's primarily a videographer, you're primarily a photographer. And you got to take that into account when you're picking your camera body and your lenses.
Yeah, totally.
So, well, good stuff.
Awesome.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate you having me over. And guys, thanks for listening and stay gritty.
Fellow anglers and outdoorsmen, let me share a quote with you. There is a delight in the hardy life of the open. There are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness, that can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm. The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. Those wise words are from Theodore Roosevelt. Please remember that our right to fish depends on habitat. Let's be good stewards of our fisheries and fight to protect and preserve our public lands. Thank you for listening to the Gritty Angler Podcast. We appreciate your support and love hearing your feedback. As always, good luck on all of your fishing adventures and stay gritty.